Receptive experiences, visual, olfactory, what we see, what we smell, interoceptive, for example, pain, hunger, thirst, proprioceptive, like body reposition, balance, things like this, all this kind of experiences. And I'm not trying to do here, to solve here, the hard problem of consciousness, as Chalmers put it. I'm not trying to tell you what exactly consciousness is, to define it for you. What I'm trying to do is to tell you about an approach through which we could perhaps, in the not too far future, do all these things. So this is the subject of this is the topic of my lecture, and this is what I am not trying to do. I'm not trying to solve the hard problem, but I am trying to do something very ambitious here. I'm trying to suggest an approach of how to do it, how to go about it. Now, what I'm trying to do as an evolutionary biologist, when I was beginning to think about this thing, it was over 10 years ago. And it was because my friend, Simona Ginsburg, the neurobiologist, tempted me. I thought that never in my life will I approach such a difficult problem, because it will drive me crazy. But I did in the end. She said, well, you know, people didn't think about it evolutionarily. Isn't it worthwhile? And so on. So I became tempted, and that is it. And that's the story behind the last 12 years. Anyway, so as an evolutionary biologist, when I was trying to think about this problem, I thought, well, how can I apply an evolutionary approach to this? And the kind of approach that I was thinking about, that would be, I thought, a good approach, was to adopt an evolutionary transition-oriented approach. Now, evolutionary transition approach is the kind of approach for the evolutionary biologist among you who have perhaps heard about a very important book in evolutionary biology, The Major Transitions in Evolution by Maynard Smith and Sudbury. So what they are doing, they are trying to see how major changes in the way that information is transmitted and stored, how these major changes actually happen, to try and look at the transition from a state where a particular structure or way of storage of information or whatever did not yet exist, and then how it came to exist. For example, how chromosomes were creating from genes that were not linked together, and things like this. So I thought this kind of approach, the evolutionary transition approach, is a good approach for this kind of problem. And this kind of approach was also used for the origin of life, which, as I will argue, has some conceptual similarities to the problem of the origin of consciousness. The other reason, so if we're applying this approach, the evolutionary transition approach, we are looking at the simplest possible system that has the property in which we are interested, in our case, consciousness, because if we're looking at evolved animals, highly evolved animals, and human beings, we cannot see the basic structure. It's already masked by all the many evolutionary changes that the system have undergone. So it is a good idea, in order to understand something very complex, to start with the simplest possible system in existence, if we can identify it, of course. Now, the other reason that an evolutionary transition framework can be good is that maybe we can learn from the way that people have approached similar problems. And as I said already, the kind of system that we had in mind when we started to think about it was the problem of life. How living systems have come into being? How do evolutionary biologists approach this also very, very difficult problem? So there are many ways of approaching the problem of the origin of life, and people have been working on it for a very long time, much longer than the modern origin of consciousness, which started to be taken seriously in the 90s. People started to develop, started to dare to develop a kind of neurological approach to this problem, but the evolutionary side of things was not very, is still not very well developed. Nevertheless, in the origin of life, the situation is different. People have been working on it at least for 80 years, very, very intensely. And the approach that we decided to take was an approach that was developed by a Hungarian the theoretical chemist, Tibor Ganti. He was an organic chemist, a theoretical chemist, and a theoretical biologist. And he developed very early on an extremely useful approach to the question of origin of life. Now, what he did was this. He took from the literature a list of characteristics that are necessary and jointly sufficient for the description of what we call a living system. So he looked at a lot of the work that has been done over the years, and he tried to compile a list which will be more or less a consensus list. Then what he did was to construct a toy model, a simple descriptive kind of cybernetic model that spells out the dynamics, the dynamic organization that can instantiate this list, so that the properties of the list can be, you can see them appearing as you are looking at his little toy model. What he also did was, when he described this, when he built this model, he identified something that we call a transition marker. This is a capacity that the system has that allows us to say, well, if we find something, this capacity in any system, then this system, in his case, must be alive, or must have been alive. Even if we find, and I will soon give you an example, even if we find it isolated from the system in some way, we can reverse engineer the actual system of which it is part. He also, once you have this, you can point to evolutionary scenarios, you can reframe philosophical questions, and so on. So what we said was, well, let's try to do something like what Ganti said. We will look at a list of characteristics that is thought by people to be individually necessary and jointly sufficient for consciousness. And since we are not committed to any particular theory ourselves, we just will read the literature, and that's what we did for many years, I can tell you. Read the literature very thoroughly and try to compile this kind of thing, and come up with something that people would agree about it, because exactly as was the case with the origin of life, all the lists that people have suggested are very largely overlapping, although they argue greatly about what is the most important thing, and they can kill for this, as you can imagine. Anyway, but for them, these differences are very, very important, but for somebody who is an outsider, they're not very important at all. It's just a matter of emphasis. Now, we said, maybe, even if we can't build a model of minimal consciousness, because we're very far from this, maybe we can identify something that we will say, well, if this property or capacity exists in the system, this system has minimal consciousness, and then start to reverse engineer the system of which it is part. If we can do that, we've done some step forward. Of course, it's not very easy to do it, but this is the approach that we're taking. And we are suggesting a transition marker. Now, in order to give a little bit of substance to what I'm saying, I will go very, very quickly through Ganti's approach. This is a separate lecture, so I'm not going to go very quickly through it. But what he did, he had a list of criteria which are quite broad and and you know, some people will say maybe he asked for too much. So he asked for inherent unity, metabolism, inherent stability of the system, and information carrying subsystem, program control in the system, growth and multiplication, he said, and these three last things are important: hereditary system enabling open-ended evolution and mortality. Now, what he wanted to define, to describe, was a minimal life system which will persist and will not be destroyed very, very easily. Because you can imagine something that will sort of be okay with our definitions of life, but it will be very, very fragile. It will disappear very quickly, so it will not persist over evolution. We will not see life, in fact. It will form for a minute and disappear. So he wanted something that will be evolutionarily stable. Life, evolutionarily stable life. Not just life, evolutionarily stable life. And for that, he said, we need to have growth and multiplication. And for this, he said, we need to have something, a hereditary system enabling open-ended evolution. So that heredity, so that the number of hereditary variants that the system contains is much, much larger than the number of environments that the organism can ever meet. Heredity, in his words, and in Maynard Smith and Sudbury terms, is unlimited. Unlimited not in the mathematical sense, but in the sense that there is a vast search space that is allowed by the system. That's all. Okay, so then what he did was to create a model which he called the chemoton. I will not go into this model because it will take the rest of the lecture. But it's a relatively simple model. It's not very simple, but it's a relatively simple model, which is based on three coupled autocatalytic systems: a membrane system, an internal metabolic engine, and a polymer that is controlling the rate of metabolism, the rate of the formation of the membrane. And since the membrane is two-dimensional and the volume is three-dimensional, there will be kind of spatial distortion, and there will be the membrane will sort of the system, the chemoton, will sort of create two chemotons from one. It will break into two parts, and this is due to the spatial distortion that will occur and the properties of biological membranes, even very simple biological membranes. It is basically it's an autopoietic system, to use Varela and Maturana term, and it is basically, this particular system is a system made up of three coupled autocatalytic systems. Now, what he said was that the polymer there has to have the property of having unlimited heredity, and if we have such a system of unlimited heredity, this allows the system to persist over evolutionary time, and it is a marker for the system as a whole. So if we will find, for example, in a different planet, very long molecules of DNA, and we don't know anything, or something like DNA, RNA, doesn't matter, like 200 base pairs long or something like this, then if we would try to think how this, and they're frozen in little puddles on this planet, right? We don't see anything else just then, but we know that they must have been synthesized somehow. So how were they synthesized? So if we work back into the kind of mechanism, a kind of system that could have synthesized them, we will come to define something like a minimal cell, like a protocell, because in order for this very, very complex molecules to be formed in a non-accidental manner, systematically, we need a system that can do it. We need an enabling system. So an enabling system is a system that enables the developmental construction and maintenance of the focal trait. I have a kind of switch, a kind of twist on Pali's argument here that I think is fun, so I will go through it. If you remember, William Paley in natural theology said that if we find a watch in a meadow, this proves the existence of a designer, and therefore we have to assume that God exists, right? Because how otherwise can we understand this? So he said, in crossing a meadow, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and were asked how the stone came to be here. I might possibly answer that for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. But suppose I found a watch upon the ground, it should be inquired how the watch had happened to be in this place. I should hardly think of the answer I had before given, that for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. There must have existed at some time, at some place or other, an artificer or artificers who formed this watch, and so on. So this is the argument from design. Now, we know that Darwin suggested an alternative to this. But I want to ask a different question. Let's say we find a watch, and we want to know, how did the watch come to be there? We don't have to think about the evolution of watches, right? We have to think about the world in which watches are formed. A world in which there are factories, a world in which time measuring is important, with a particular culture, world in which there are watchmakers, and there are people who buy the watches, and so on and so forth. So this is the enabling system of the watch. Once we understand this enabling system, then we can ask the question, okay, how did the watch culturally evolve? And we can find all kinds of interesting answers about it. We should go to history and so on and so forth, and read about the sociology and of technology and sociology in general, and so on and so forth, in order to answer this kind of question. Now, the same is true for an unlimited, for example, for the DNA. If we found a DNA, we would not ask, well, how did this DNA evolve? But how is it? In what kind of system did it exist? Well, how was it maintained? How was it synthesized? Then we can ask, how did something like DNA evolved in the first place? Only after we understand the enabling system. It is the enabling system that is alive. DNA is not alive. DNA is a molecule. It is not alive, right? I mean, it's very difficult to think about it in this term. It is the cell that contains DNA that is alive. Okay. So we decided we'll take this kind of route. We'll try to compile a list of consciousness properties, and then to find something that we think can be a good transition marker, something that we can use to reverse it, to start reverse engineering the system, something that when we find it, we will say, well, a system that has this capacity has to be at least minimally conscious, okay? And we suggest such a marker. Our marker is something that we call unlimited associative learning, and the rest of this lecture will be devoted to justifying why it's a good marker and why it's a good way of starting to think about the problem of the evolutionary origins of consciousness and about what consciousness is by thinking along these lines. Okay, we'll do it by defining what we're talking about. We'll show that the characteristics of consciousness as compiled by people who didn't think about unlimited associative learning at all, because they took very, very different approaches. We will show that these characteristics of consciousness are also those that an animal with unlimited associative learning must have. And once we sort of tentatively accept this, I'm not saying that you have to accept it, but it's an approach. You can improve on it. Once we accept it, it has a lot of implications for a lot of questions in evolutionary biology and in biology in general. Okay. So what are the lists that we find in the literature when people are trying to compile, to say, well, this is what we're talking about. This is what we, neuroscientists, think about. Because most of the people are cognitive psychologists, or psychologists, and sometimes philosophers. This is what we think when we're thinking about minimal consciousness. Again, not the reflective consciousness of humans. So they say a system, an animal, or a creature with minimal consciousness has to have flexible value systems and goals, so that it can attribute a value to different things. This is good, this is bad, and the many, many different things can be good or bad. And it's flexible, it can change over time, in time, and according to circumstances. The system has to have some unity and diversity through some kind of sensory binding, so that we see, and so that we and maybe other animals, if we're thinking about visual system, see an apple as both green and round, and not green plus round. There's some kind of binding. And this leads to the notion of mapping and representation within some system, some internal system, the brain usually. People are talking about global availability of information involving multidirectional feedbacks, both top-down and bottom-up, and re-entrant interactions. Those of you that are familiar with Gerald Edelman know that this was for him a very, very important part of his notion of consciousness. When people are thinking about an animal that is conscious, they are thinking about something that they call temporal thickness. It's a term that was introduced by William James already. Well, it was introduced, it was not introduced in this, it was not his term, but he was talking about the fact that that there is a thick time, so that when something is experienced, the experience takes time, always takes time. It's not something that happens immediately. And we know today from neuroscience that this is indeed the case, that if we're exposed very, very briefly to some kind of stimulus, we do not experience it consciously, although it can affect our actions later on. People are talking about selection processes, that there are a lot of processes of exploration and selective stabilization at different levels, at the neural level, at the action level, and at the attention. People are talking about selective attention. That all these selection processes are something that is inherent to consciousness. They're talking about intentionality, about aboutness, and when they're talking about that, they usually mean that there's some kind of referral, some kind of mapping, so that things in the body or in the world are mapped and are referred to within some internal system, the brain usually. People are talking about embodiment. It is not the brain that thinks, it is the animal and brained animal that thinks. The body is very important. The body is a source of a lot of the inputs that make consciousness possible. Now, I gave you here, there are here all kinds of names, because these are some of the people who talked about these things, but they all agree about this. They would all agree about this list, although different people would emphasize different aspects of it. And as I said, would argue greatly, arguing that the particular aspect they are interested in is probably the most important or something like that, but I think that most of them would say, well, this list is okay, more or less, it is a consensus list. So we said, okay, this is the kind of list that people have in mind. Different people from different disciplines with different approaches. So we said, okay, after a lot of work, and I will not bore you with what we did for what the kind of things we went through. We went through a lot of possibilities and discarded them one after the other. We thought that unlimited associative learning is a good marker for a system that has consciousness. Now, what is unlimited associative learning? It is a system of learning through association, operant conditioning, instrumental and Pavlovian classical conditioning, but of compounds, novel compound percepts, novel compound actions, that allows the individual to learn and recall association between modalities through ontogeny, and the number of percepts and actions that can be learned and remembered is far, far greater than the number of environments in which the organism is likely ever to meet, or even more broadly than that the population of this organism is likely to have experienced. Now, we also demand, so this unlimited associative learning, which we call UAL, describe the potential to exhibit associative learning that involves compound stimuli and action, and is also cumulative. So you can learn one thing and build on this thing, and learn another thing and build on this thing and learn another thing. And we can ascribe, and by doing this cumulative learning, we use our value system in a flexible way, because something that was in the beginning not something of value becomes of value, and then it can be used to assign value to yet another thing, and so on. And all this happens during ontogeny, during the lifetime of the organism. Because evolution is also a system of building up through selection of various adaptation to the environment. But here we're talking about a system that is doing it in ontogenetic time, not in phylogenetic time. So, and we argue that just as unlimited heredity opened up a huge space of possibilities, it enabled open-ended evolution, so unlimited associative learning allows open-ended ontogenetic adjustments and can lead to quite complex behavior. Not always, but complex enough. There will be always constraints. So what we demand from associative learning is, as I said, it's a form of classical and operant associative learning conditioning, where the conditional stimulus, which is called by psychologists the CS, or the reinforced behavior, which is also called the US when you're thinking about classical conditioning, can be compound, i.e. consistent of several fused features. It is novel, that is, it is neither a reflex reaction, nor it is something that has been learned already in the past, and it can be the basis of second-order learning. So that what you have learned, what was a CS, can become a US. It's quite a demanding system. It's not easy to have this kind of system, and not everybody has it. Not every animal has it. But a lot of animals, in fact, do, quite surprisingly. Now, in order to think about this system, okay, this is a behavioral description of this system. In order to think about this system functionally, in order for this to happen, for compounds, for example, to form, there must be mechanisms that integrate the various underlying features to form a compound. And since to form a compound, we know this is a multi-stage process, so you don't form a compound by taking a lot of things and putting them all together in one go. You take some things, put some of them together, then you put some of the things that you put together again, and so on and so forth. So we need some kind of hierarchical system that is enabling, a multi-stage hierarchical system that is enabling this kind of encoding. And we also need for this system to be efficient, so that not everything that we experience will be is encoded as if we start from nothing, but that what we have already learned, what we have already encoded, will constrain it. So there must be some kind of not only bottom-up process, but top-down process that will constrain the kind of thing that we should see and will make our processing of the information very much more efficient. And the theories of predictive coding developed by Friston and his colleagues today, and also by other people, are a very good example of taking this approach in order to understand how complex processing happens in the brain. There must be also a memory system, a dedicated memory system that enables subsequent retrieval based on learned compound patterns. So we need to have a memory system that is based not only on local strengthening of synapses, but also on something that will store complex patterns of perception and complex patterns of action. And we know that in mammals we have the hippocampus for percepts and the cerebellum for action. And we need also an evaluation system, a value system that is able to assign value to any compound input and take the general homeostatic state of the organism into account. So we need systems that are integrating information, and we need some connections between these systems. And what I'm trying to show you now are how we envisage the system as in a very, very simplistic kind of way. It's a toy model. It will look a little bit complex, but it's not really. Okay. So in order to make things a little bit easy, we decided to use an idealized kind of system. Because in real associative learning, when we're learning, for example, think about a rat that is learning that it has to push a lever in order to get food. Okay? Classical operant conditioning. Now the rat is of course learning about its own actions, but it's not just learning about its own actions. It's also learning about the lever. That the lever is something, that this lever is something it has to push. So it's learning not only about itself, it's also learning about the world. And in most realistic situations, we are learning always both about ourselves and about the world. We can distinguish between these two cases in the lab by making specific experiments that just focus on one type of learning rather than the other, self-learning or world learning. But these are artificial situations. But these artificial situations are useful. And experimental psychologist called Björn Brems in Germany suggested two concepts, world learning and self-learning. And as I said, these are a little bit idealized, but they allow us to think about the system in a very theoretically clean way, so to speak. And then we can mess it up again. So what we have here, the blue thing is, well, never mind. Well, the blue thing is something that we can call the CS, the conditional stimulus, the thing that, like if we're thinking about Pavlovian kind of learning, it's the ringing of the bell. And the red thing is the US, it is the reinforcement, it's naturally reinforcing thing, for example, food. And the yellow thing is the motor action. So usually when we are learning about it, we hear the animal hears the buzz, and then it gets food, or it is exposed to the smell of food, which is eliciting a response, the yellow thing, which a motor response, and so on. Now, there is a connection here between the motor thing and the motor thing and the state of the world, because what we are seeing here, because there's always some action involved. It is true that in the case of Pavlov tying his poor dogs to the stand, we don't see very much action, because there is no locomotor action. But if he wasn't tying them there, they would come and approach and sniff and approach the food. There would be motor behavior. In this case too, there is a kind of motor behavior, because there is always exploratory behavior. The dogs are hungry, right? They are searching for food, even if he doesn't allow them a lot of search. So in normal conditions, there is always a motor aspect, but in this case, in the world learning, in the pure world learning, it is not learned. So we go from receptors to some kind of neural systems that analyze, that process the inputs from this receptor, the S1, S2, S3. We're going to the combination of this because we're forming a compound. We're then having a reinforcement, which is also going, of course, through some kind of sensory system. And then we're having a motor action, which is also going not straight, but it's going from the motor system to particular CPGs, which are a pattern generator. And we have and the animal has learned. Now, what we added here to this very, very simple, what is added here are several things. The first thing that is added here is hierarchical levels. So we go from R1, from the receptors, to first processing level, and to a compound kind of level of processing, of percepts. We go from a motor system that is creating a model of the animal's whole body, because a whole body is not it's not just a reflex reaction, and we're going from a reinforcement system which is taking into consideration the whole homeostatic state of the animal. And the reinforcement depends on the homeostatic state of animal. In addition to that, we added two systems, further integrating system. A system that integrates the motor and the perceptual system. This is AU, the association unit, and a dedicated memory unit. And there are arrows coming up and down from this unit, which show the bottom-up and the top-down reactions that occur. And the T1, T2, and T2 here are showing us the temporal relations during this process. Right? This is very pure world learning of compounds. The motor system, the animal is doing some action, this action is reinforced, but in order for it to remember compound actions and to act on the basis of this memory again, it needs, again, the green dedicated memory system. It probably will be something like the cerebellum, and some kind of association area which will associate the motor system with the perceptual system, because of course there is a perceptual system there, right? The reinforcement is based on something the animal senses and to which it responds. Although you can, in the lab, of course, trigger just dopamine neurons. But this is usually not what happens in nature. Now we can put it together. I'm just showing it, it's a horrible picture. It's very, very complicated, but when we put these things together, which is the realistic case, because these things happen together, we have this type of system. Now you can think, well, this is too complicated. But it's not, because we are really thinking about one of the most complicated things in the world, which is consciousness. And if we can capture something of the kind of dynamics that is behind it, and I'm not saying that this is enough, by no means is it enough. In the same way that DNA is not life, this is not consciousness. But it is but it could be used as a marker. Now, why do I say that? Before I say why it is used as a marker, I want to ask a question. Okay, this structure that we were talking about, what kind of structures can implement this kind of things? Do we have in animals, in all groups of animals that we're aware of, the kind of integrating sensory areas, integrating motor areas that integrate between them, dedicated memory systems, and if we do have such things, where are they, how are they organized, and what groups show them and what groups don't? So we did a very, very big survey. Not only we did a big survey of the literature, and fortunately there is today very, very great interest in studying complex anatomical structures and functional anatomical structures, and showing the homologies between the structures in different groups. So here, what we know in vertebrates, there are several structures in the cerebral cortex and the midbrain that are crucial for compound perception and actions, and they have been identified. And what is very interesting, that people have found very similar, functionally similar structures in arthropods, mainly in the insects, but not only in insects, also in crabs, for example. And another very interesting thing, which is not, so if we're looking here at mammals and insects, and we're looking at what we see here is the work done by Strausfeld and Hirth, which is showing the functional organization of important association and integration and memory areas in the brain of mammals and insects, showing amazing homologies. So amazing that they suggested that the vertebrates and the arthropod have a common origin. And so, they are evolutionarily linked. I'm not sure that this is necessary. This is one hypothesis. The other hypothesis is that there are enormously strong constraints, developmental constraints that are leading to this kind, that are leading to parallel evolution. What is very interesting is, I will not go through this table, but what we did was, we didn't look just at vertebrates and insects, we looked at other groups, and the other group that shows this kind of structures is the cephalopods. This is a group of mollusks, very highly evolved mollusks. They evolved about 300 million years ago, something like this. And they have these structures. The vertebrates and the arthropods evolved in the Cambrian 540 million years ago. Now, so we asked ourselves, okay, how is UAL? Now let's take a completely different approach. Let's forget about anatomy. Let's try and see where in the literature of experimental psychology do we find evidence for complex associative learning that is a good, that we can use as a proxy for UAL. Completely different approach. In fact, we started with this. We didn't start with anatomy. And what we found again is the same groups. The vertebrates, all the vertebrates. Not all of them have been worked on, of course. The arthropods and the cephalopods. There are some other groups where we simply, a lot of groups we know nothing at all about. Absolutely nothing. So we can't tell. And there are also many groups about, we know more about the brains of animals than we know about the behavior of animals, the learning of animals. But also about the brains, there are many, many groups about which we simply do not know enough. So this is all very, very tentative. But this is the state of the art as far as we can tell today. So, now when people are thinking about consciousness, and people are trying to say, well, who has it? And, you know, you have opinions ranging from only humans and to all living creatures, and even if you take Chalmers seriously, the thermostat has consciousness too. Little, but consciousness. Anyway, so you have many, many opinions. Now, if you think that UAL is a good marker, then you would say, well, it seems that vertebrates and several invertebrate groups can be said to have the properties that are necessary for consciousness, that if it's a marker, then they have it. And how can we convince ourselves and convince you that this is indeed the case? Well, we go to UAL and we try to understand what kind of system, what is the enabling system that we must imagine in order to have UAL, exactly as we did with life. So, the enabling system of UAL must be able to enhance sensory discrimination and allow sensory discrimination. Categorization of things as totalities. And this is associated with unity and diversity. We can see many, animals can see many different things as totalities, as coherent wholes, not as bits put together. So something that is yellow, green, and red is not just yellow, green, and red. It depends how it is organized in space and when it appears in order for it to have a certain effect on the animal. So it's not just the pure perceptual aspects, but the organization that is important. And this is called, in the psychological literature, non-elemental kind of learning, associative learning. There must be a flexible value system, because otherwise we will not have second order kind of cumulative learning. There must be temporal thickness, because this process, if we are right in the functional description of the system, there are a lot of loops of going up and down for a percept to form. And this obviously takes time. Now, we must assume as background conditions that the animal is embodied, and we must assume also that there is some form of referral, of representation. These are necessary assumptions about the working of the system. None of them is sufficient. All of them, we believe, are necessary. And we believe that in order to have such a system, an animal must have a central nervous system. In order to do all these integrations, all these loops, all these referrals, and so on and so forth. Now, if we go again through the list, and I don't think I have very much time for that, because I think I'm almost running out, but we started, when? 6:15. Okay, so I have 10 minutes, it's enough. Okay, so if we go through all the properties that people assign to a conscious system, and we say, well, do we need them? If we're looking at a system, at an animal that has UAL, does a UAL system, the kind of system that we described in our toy model, does it require these things? And I want you to believe me that we didn't make up the system in order for it to be compatible. And we see that they do, that we need to have a flexible value system, we need unity and diversity, we need global accessibility of information, we need temporal thickness, we need selection processes, because without inhibition, a lot of inhibition, nothing will happen. Learning is dependent not only on excitatory connections, but a lot of inhibitory connections, and we know in fact that most of the things that happen during learning is excluding a lot of possibilities. You are choosing one possibility and excluding most, if not all. There must be some kind of intentionality which is captured by predictive coding, hierarchical processing at different levels, and some kind of mapping relations which can be said to be about what is happening in the body, in the world, and there must be, of course, embodiment in self, because without inputs from the body, we cannot have information about the homeostatic state of the animal, and the animal cannot. I mean, there won't be an animal. Okay. Now, okay, so I think that this parallel is very telling. It's telling us not that we have found the marker, the best marker possible, but we found something that can be used, at least until a better suggestion is promoted, as a marker of minimal consciousness. And if you accept that, then I want to clarify what we do, what is meant and what is not meant by saying that something like UAL in this case is an evolutionary marker. First of all, it's a positive marker. So if an animal has this, if we find an animal, we don't know anything about it, but we're testing it for this kind of compound learning, non-elemental learning, of compound second order and so on, and it does it, then we will say, well, there is a very good chance, according to us, this animal is minimally conscious. But if we find an animal that does not show this, this is not a proof that this animal is not conscious. It's only a positive marker. And why do we say this? We say this because if we're thinking about a neonate, about a child that just comes to the world, obviously it cannot learn in a UAL manner when it is first born. It can't do it. It has the enabling system that when it matures and so on, it will be able to do it. But it doesn't have it. So clearly the absence of UAL is not a good reason to say that an animal doesn't have minimal consciousness. And it's the same if we're thinking again about DNA and the heredity, about which we know a lot more and is more familiar to us. Think about a cell like an erythrocyte, yes, a blood cell. Now in a blood cell, the nucleus dies and disintegrates, all right? Nevertheless, the cell is alive for 120 days. So life is not defined by the presence of unlimited heredity. It doesn't have unlimited heredity, right, for this 120 days. Yes, it will die at the end, of course. But for the 120 days without UAL, it will live. And in the same way, we think that an animal that is devoid of UAL may be because it doesn't need it anymore, evolutionarily. Maybe it became stationary. I don't know what happened to it. All kinds of things happen to it. It just doesn't need to learn in this complicated way anymore. Will it experience? We think yes. We think it will. But if this will go on for a long time, evolutionarily, then it will lose consciousness eventually, because a lot of the enabling system, which is the system that was conscious, will be degraded because there's no need for all these complex mechanisms. So what we think is that although in ontogeny there is not a necessary connection between UAL and minimal consciousness, evolutionarily these two systems were coupled. So, when did all this happen? If we take UAL as an evolutionary marker, then the first appearance of UAL was in the Cambrian, 540 million years ago, when the arthropods and the vertebrates first appeared. It probably first evolved in the arthropods, not in the vertebrates. The vertebrates, the arthropods were the terrible predators of the Cambrian, as you can see here. Now, if I will manage to use this thing, no, I don't manage to use this thing. Right, where is it? Oh, here. Okay, yeah, I found it. You see these things, one here and one there? These are the fish that existed at that time. Very primitive little, 3 centimeter long, vegetarians, peace-loving creatures. They have become predators long after that, but they needed to be very aware of the monsters surrounding them, which were arthropods. Arthropods with eyes, complicated brains, and a good ability to move, a lot of degrees of freedom in movements. We believe that these were the first animals that evolved UAL, unlimited associative learning, and were minimally conscious, and that the vertebrates who found a way of escaping them by also evolving unlimited associative learning. It's a great adaptation. So they did it in this way. Other animals found other ways of doing it, like camouflage, like developing terrible toxins, like burrowing in the ground and having activities that do not coincide with those of the horrible predators, and so on and so forth. Nothing is perfect in the world, so of course nobody completely could adapt. I mean, that's why evolution goes on. But we believe that many of the adaptations that we find in animals in the Cambrian, and the huge diversity of Cambrian animals, is partly the result of the evolution of first associative learning, and very soon afterwards in some groups, unlimited associative learning. So we think that the unlimited associative learning first appeared in the Cambrian 540 million years ago, and 250 million years ago it appeared in the cephalopods, which completely in parallel, in a very, very different way, evolved the system too. Now, we're not totally, I can say with happiness that we're not totally alone in thinking this. There is a growing number of biologists who, for reasons different from ours, converge on the idea that something like consciousness must have evolved in the Cambrian. They think about this for different reasons from ours. They didn't start from learning, they start either from brain anatomy. They start from brain anatomy, from reasons that have to do with the complexity of the brain and with the association of this complexity with something that is probably necessary for a minimal consciousness. But this is still a minority view, what I'm presenting here. So our idea is that it has been not only has appeared in, not only has UAL appeared in the Cambrian and was a facet, in a sense, of minimal consciousness, it also led to arm races and to the evolution of sensory modalities, to new ways of learning, to camouflage, to a lot of things. And this happened, but this is a completely different story, through something that is known as the bonding effect. Okay, this is the basic idea. So the basic idea is that what we're suggesting is a marker, evolutionary marker of minimal consciousness. This, if one accepts this as a tentative marker, it has evolutionary implication. It also has some implication for research about which I did not talk, but I will be glad to do so in the answer questions part. Thank you very much.